Mr. Cardenas, thank you for joining us and for facilitating this interview. My name is Fariza Hanif, the editor-in-chief of the newsroom here in Guyana. I have with me here Sharda Bacchus from the Starbuck News, the privately owned Starbuck News. And we have Kamal King from the privately owned Kaitro News. And we have Gerald Bryan from the privately owned Guyana Times. These are the three leading newspapers here in Guyana. And the newsroom is one of the leading online websites and TV stations in the country. So we just want you to start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background for the benefit of the Guyanese public.
Yes, thank you, Farid, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I hope everyone is staying safe during these crazy times that we're all living in. My name is Jose Cardenas. I'm a consultant in Washington, D.C. I have been in and around U.S. policy towards the Western Hemisphere for about 35 years. I've been in government. I spent some time, for example, in the Congress as a congressional staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee doing the Western Hemisphere. I spent time at the Organization of American States, and during the administration of George Bush 43, the son, I was a senior advisor at the Department of State in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. And then from there, I also went and served on the White House National Security Council, again, Western Hemisphere Affairs. And then finally, towards the end of the Bush administration, I was the acting assistant administrator. In other words, I was the head of the Bureau that oversaw aid programs in the Latin America and the Caribbean. And since then, I have again been in consulting where I basically represent in Washington anybody who needs help, frankly, and that's interacting with the executive branch and interacting with Congress. And I also write frequently on affairs in the hemisphere. For example, I've written a lot on Venezuela and the crisis there, and also I've interacted with the media, providing analysis, opinion on breaking events in the hemisphere.
Thank you for that. I'm sure you would have been following our elections process here. It's been over 100 days since Guyanese went to the poll, and no winner has been declared even after we would have embarked on a 33-day recount process. Would you like to share your opinion with us on what you think has been happening and what can happen if there's no winner declared in a reasonable time?
Thank you for that question. Excellent kickoff to our discussion. I can't help but think that there must be many Guyanese who are maybe a little bit taken aback by the attention that the election in Guyana has attracted in Washington. Well, there's a variety of reasons why that is, why that's so. Is that number one is that Washington policymakers and those who follow events in the region in Washington have become quite sensitized to the, let's call it the health of democracy in the Western Hemisphere. And as you all know, last year, for example, saw many public manifestations in a lot of the countries of Latin America, Chile, Ecuador, and all of that was basically expressions of frustration with, as I said, the health of democracy in those respective countries. And so that's sort of caught Washington's attention. And so there is a renewed attention in Washington to democratic processes in the hemisphere. And that naturally has why you may see this unprecedented, at least from Washington's perspective, as far as the United States is concerned, attention towards Guyana, and make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen, the election in Guyana has drawn. We've seen it in statements by the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Mr. Senator Risch, and so the controversies and the let's call it the evolution of the political process in Guyana has, as Farine you correctly noted, is that an election that took place March 2nd, and here we are June 27th, and there is still not a declared winner. Well, that's troublesome, and it generates an amount of concern for the health of the Guyanese democracy, and also for the Guyanese people, in that they dutifully went to the polls, exercising their franchise, hardly won ability to vote, and yet here we are, as you said, Farine, 100 and some days later, and yet the Guyanese people do not know who is going to be leading their next government. And all of this, of course, I do not have to tell anybody here that it comes against the backdrop of an extraordinary period in Guyana's history, whereby your country is about to launch into a completely new era based on the fossil fuels that have been discovered off your coast. So that sort of maximizes it. Sort of, all comes into the quote unquote perfect storm of heightened attention. And what Washington wants, what the United States wants, is frankly what I suspect most of the Guyanese people want. They want to move on, and they want to move on. They want certainty. They want political certainty, and they want to begin this process of getting more information and understanding more how their government is intending to manage this newfound wealth that is going to be experienced by Guyana in the next few years.
And I will just ask my colleagues if they have any questions for you. They could go ahead and do so.
I wanted to ask about some statements made by Mr. Bart Fisher.
Oh.
Yeah, so he has commented on the political situation here and of statements he has seen made by senators and other officials in the US, and has called those statements premature. There has been a lot of sentiment where the coalition and its allies are concerned to say that foreigners making statements about Guyana's political situation is premature, or that they're interfering in Guyana's politics. So would you say that now is the right time for foreign actors to be putting their voice in, or is it necessary that they wait until Guyana has already sorted its political situation out?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kamal. I did see some statements by Mr. Fisher, who I do not know, but have seen them in the context of the situation that the Guyana is experiencing today. First of all, on the question of, and I've seen this before, and I'm sensitive to it, about whether outside stakeholders, not only the United States but OAS. There's CARICOM, the ABCE countries that have been making also statements. Whether this, it's a sensitive issue about interference, and I would respond in a couple of ways. I think that I even though many people have don't really remember or place much stock in a document that was signed by the countries of the Western Hemisphere in 2001 called the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And in that document, it says that democracy is not only the form of government that should be in place in all countries of the hemisphere, but that other countries have an obligation to defend democracy wherever it is lacking or threatened or non-existent. So under that that document, which was signed, again, I think that the one outlier may have been Cuba for obvious reasons, but the Inter-American Democratic Charter gives calls on all countries to be active in defending democracy. And when it comes to the United States, you know, for good or bad, the United States has unique capabilities, I think, to discourage bad actors from undermining democratic processes. And I know that that the gentleman made a comment about not only prematurity, but that somehow the United States lacks any ability, meaning if the United States were to, it has no authority to impose sanctions. Well, I think that's completely erroneous. In fact, it's rather stunning that a Washington attorney would make such a statement. I mean, you pretty much have to sleepwalked through the last 10 years when it comes to your next door neighbor in Venezuela to, anyway, question Washington's authorities to issue sanctions that affect the United States. And so the use of sanctions, frankly, are a disincentive for people who have malign interests. And I think claiming that a individual, for example, in Georgetown, involved in the election who may have bad intentions can do so with impunity is dangerous and it's reckless. So anybody in Georgetown who is thinking of either diverting the outcome of the election, the will of the Guyanese people, has been manifested not only in the March 2nd election, but in the recount, which has been pretty clear from all press reports. And it seems to be most of the international organizations, including CARICOM, have basically concluded that the recount shows that the opposition won the election. And if there's somebody that tries to thwart the will of the Guyanese people in that respect, Washington absolutely has measures it can impose on that individual that relates to their ability to, for example, have a bank account in the United States or otherwise do banking in their private lives that touch the U.S. economic system. That person also can lose their ability to travel to the United States. Their visas can be revoked. And if it is decided to be a larger conspiracy, and I'm just speculating here, but it's important to understand what the options are in the United States for all concerned, is that if there is determined to be a government-wide conspiracy to thwart the will of the Guyanese people, absolutely the U.S. can place sectoral sanctions, which would, of course, threaten the oil patrimony that Guyana now possesses.
Okay, thank you for that. I think Kamal has a follow-up to your answer.
There's been a lot of misinformation being peddled in the press in Guyana. And I just wanted to know what has filtered to Washington with regards to claims of electoral fraud by voter impersonation claims of dead people voting or people who are out of the jurisdiction but have had votes cast in their name?
Well, the Guyanese press has done an extraordinary job of covering the full range of issues that have arisen, and certainly I've seen them here in Washington through obviously the miracle of the internet. I think that and again, Kamal, you mentioned disinformation uh, and manipulation of electoral. Well, that's something that as you know, is not native to Guyana. It's something that we here in the United States also deal with quite frequently. But at the end of the day, I think that the danger here is even in the United States, no election is going to achieve metaphysical perfection, and I think that that it is a constant challenge for any country in the hemisphere to conduct an election that is as trouble-free as possible. And but then the concern is setting impossible standards and then attempting to correct them. What you're talking about is you're trying to, it's akin to trying to reform, trying to remake an aircraft while you're flying it. And so I think that those issues of what some are claiming to be what you said, some manipulations and deficiencies, I think that that those absolutely should be addressed in the follow-up to Guyana's follow-up elections, whether it is for parliament, national, local leaders. But that's something I believe that should be a continually addressed by the authorities and civil society after this election is completed. Because what I think is that what the precedent you don't want to set is again being able to call denounce an election that has been taking place that in contrast to one, for example, to say in Venezuela, which raises all sorts of concerns and issues. And I'm not comparing the two, but what I am saying is that if an aggrieved party can torpedo an election whereby the international observers have basically concluded was a free and fair election, then there is no election anywhere in the hemisphere that's going to be able to pass the test of again that perfection. So yes, these are concerns. I think they should be addressed by the appropriate authorities in Guyana in the run-up to another election, so that that concern is addressed forcefully and legitimately by the authorities. But to try and go back when you have a situation where international observers and others have said, well, we've seen elections take place. We've seen them. We've monitored them in the Caribbean. We've monitored them in Latin America. We did not see an egregious breach of the of what's being asserted now. So I think that that's kind of as outsiders looking in from our perch here in Washington, we have to place, and we do. When I mean we, I mean policymakers, concerned observers. is that that's why the international observers carry so much importance, because they're the ones that sort of give you that impartial, objective statement, analysis of the mechanics of what happened.
We have Jarrell, you have a question.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Cardenas. I have a question with regards to the oil industry. You had mentioned it just now, and you touched on the issue of sanctions. Hypothetically, and in the unfortunate event that it reaches that stage, can you elaborate on how badly sanctions can impact Guyana's oil industry and the overall economy of a middle-income country like Guyana?
Yeah, it's certainly, Gerald, a great question. I mean, it certainly is no one's first thought or objective. And it's, you know, again, you know, as you noted, we are speaking in hypothetics. And it's certainly nobody wants to go in that direction. But I'm just stating an objective fact that should the process in Guyana break down and you have an unwillingness of one of the parties in the election to concede, and this uncertainty continues, there is going to be discussion in Washington about, you know, and in concert with the OAS, and no doubt in concert in discussions and consultations with CARICOM. And ladies and gentlemen, that does happen because I've been on the inside, and there will be consultations with the OAS. There will be consultations with the ABCE countries about, you know, how best the international community can help bring this situation to a successful end. And within those conversations, certainly no one is going to start by talking about the oil, but you know, first of all, I would imagine that in those hypothetical, if the circumstances ever come to it, there will be talk of, for example, individual sanctions against people who are seen to be obstructing a successful conclusion. But if things got so bad in Guyana, and heaven forbid that you then start to see maybe some manifestations in the street about the impasse and the inability for the country to move on, then I think that naturally the international stakeholders will take a look at what else can be done to move this to help the Guyanese people come to a successful end. And in that respect, you know, the first thing you look for is what is the leverage that we have, and you know, honestly speaking, you know, we know that, you know, look what's happened next door in Venezuela. What has happened to the oil exports of Venezuela is that nobody wants to touch them, and therefore the exports of Venezuelan oil have become basically radioactive, and nobody is going to buy Venezuelan oil. No one is going to ship it, and so that you know, I'm sure that ExxonMobil is watching this with extreme concern about what the impact, the political impasse, can have on their development in partnership with the Guyanese government of the oil patrimony of Guyana. And if I was sitting in ExxonMobil's office, I would be very concerned and you know, trying to understand what the impact can be on the development. Now, you know, again, Gerald, that's a worst case scenario, because those kinds of sanctions, in, otherwise obstructing a pathway that the country has to a better future is, again, it's a worst case scenario. But those who are looking at this situation, it's only realistic to have to plot it out and to see where if this continues in this way, and otherwise meaning a successful end to the electoral process that began on March 2nd, you have to sort of map it out, as it were. And again, if this continues without end, then you have to understand that as the Trump administration says on Venezuela, all options are on the table. Now, we're not talking about any kind of military intervention. That is not in the cards, I assure you, nor should it be, and nor will it be. But you have to understand what the lay of the land looks like, and I think that again, if this doesn't end successfully, then you have to start looking at options down the road. And I think that, oil, frankly, in the world of realpolitik, oil is leverage. And if the current government of President Granger, they have to understand what the consequences are. And no one wants to go there, as you said, Gerald, because of the impact and the consequences it would mean for Guyana's future and delaying the future exploitation of its natural resources. But still, it would behoove the Granger government to understand that there will be consequences if this is not resolved to the satisfaction of the Guyanese people. It's just the way it is. And threats to democracy in the Western Hemisphere, it's different. It's different than, say, a threat to democracy in Uzbekistan, because here in the Western Hemisphere, we are a hemisphere of democracies, and we like to keep it that way. And that is why you see such a reaction to what's happening in Venezuela, why Cuba continues to be an outlier. And so, that is, and look, Guyanese paid a price to achieve their democracy. And there's a long history of development and direction towards representative government. And these are things that once they're achieved, they should be protected.
We have a follow-up from Kemal.
Guyana's natural resource fund that's keeping its oil wealth is being kept at a U.S. Federal Reserve. And we also have the company that's operating in our largest and our Stabroek block. ExxonMobil is operating there, which is a U.S. company. So what I want to ask is, could it get to a point where the government could perhaps say to ExxonMobil to pull out of its operations here? Or could we see our funds being frozen in a way that we won't be able to access the funds?
Again, Kamal, we are talking about, I can't emphasize it enough, that we are talking about the worst case scenario. And those events will be driven, those possibilities will be driven by events in Georgetown and within the current government. So yes, the answer to your question is if those funds sit in a U.S. institution, they certainly can be frozen. And you're absolutely right. I don't know I don't know in depth enough about the contracts that Guyana has signed with ExxonMobil, but I expect that it's always a possibility that the government, the current government, could attempt to, if again we are in that worst case scenario, and the oil and the funds and Exxon is prohibited from furthering exploitation or otherwise lifting the oil, moving it to international markets. Very likelihood, I suspect, that the Guyanese government could attempt to sever its relationship with ExxonMobil and perhaps bring in a company such as we've seen in Venezuela, where Russian oil interests have been brought in to work. And these are, of course, entities that work around the U.S. financial system. It's not easy. It's more expensive. So you would have to find a partner who is willing to bear the excessive cost of doing business outside the U.S. Economic banking financial system. And, they're out there. Iranian companies that operate outside the U.S. financial system and therefore evade U.S. sanctions. I suspect that if there was somebody out there willing to bear the cost, then maybe that if the government is successful in severing its relationship with ExxonMobil, I suspect that but it would be it would certainly set back the benefits accruing to Guyana to start all over again with another company, and it would certainly raise the costs of doing business outside the U.S. financial system. And again, as Venezuela has found out, it's very difficult to supply the international markets when you are attempting to otherwise sidestep or operate outside the U.S. financial system, because all of that trade takes place in dollars, and it's either all runs through New York, or else you're going to be supplying a few outliers. China has been picking up some Venezuelan oil, but it's been very expensive for them. They go through this process where you go to ship transfers, and then it sits offshore in Malaysia and Indonesia. It is a very complicated, complex effort just to operate outside the U.S. financial system. So yes, there theoretically there would be options, but they are not particularly attractive.
Mr. Cardenas, you have decades of experience in foreign relations, and you would have experienced some of what's happening here in Guyana and other countries. How do you see this ending here for us in Guyana?
Well, yes, and thank you. Looking into my crystal ball, I always try to be optimistic. When I see a man like President Granger, I think this is a man who has dedicated his life to Guyana and a better Guyana for his people. I think he has a lot of pride, and in the end, I think he'll do the right thing. I understand the situation. I think that the the ruling government has a lot of frustrations with what has taken place over the last few months. And, you know, it's a very human reaction to, you know, what I assume they feel to be, have been treated unfairly in their minds. So I get that. But I think that in the end, I think that hope that President Granger does what is best for his country. And I think that is to understand that the people have spoken. Whether you believe the election was, you know, there were problems with how it was conducted, is that my humble advice with thoughts of the best thing for the Guyanese people is for President Granger to concede, and on day 2 begin the process of competing fairly and freely in the next election, and with an eye towards rectifying any discrepancies or problems they saw in the last election, so that it doesn't happen again. But, you know, in a democracy, it calls for, you know, very, very tough decisions personally for the good of the whole. And so, you know, when we went through this process in 2000 in the United States between George W. Bush and Al Gore, there were a lot of people who were egging on Al Gore to continue to fight the uncertainty over the 2000 election we had here. And to his credit, he conceded because he did not want to put the country through any more uncertainty. And so I think that should stand as a model for President Granger. I respect President Granger. I think he's, you know, his career, his public service is admirable. But we are at a point now where I think for the good of the country that he should concede, and his coalition should start immediately on day 2 and begin preparing for the next election. And again, organize, get your message out there, and compete within the Democratic umbrella for another shot at the proverbial prize. No, I wish the best for Guyana. I think that, again, everybody up here in the United States recognizes the historical moment that Guyana is at. And everyone wishes, you know, the United States, and I've been talking with people in government, State Department, and other places, that, you know, the United States has a vested interest in making sure that this new era is successful for the Guyanese people, and that the wealth makes a real difference in people's lives, so that Guyanese don't have to leave their country in search of a better future. And I think that it is the potential is incredible to build a new Guyana under the oil wealth. There are enough examples out there on how it can be managed beneficially for the good of all Guyanese. And I think that, you know, the sooner that process can continue, I think that it's marked by a little bit too much political uncertainty right now, but political certainty and predictability is essential to maximizing those benefits. And I wish the best for the Guyanese people at this historic moment. And I hope that their international partners like the United States can be of positive benefit in helping Guyana as you embark on this new future.
Thank you very much for facilitating us, Mr. Cardenas, and we will be in touch with you.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody.